The following program is to provide entertainment and information. It is not considered to be any legal or investment advice. Good morning, appraisers. Let's talk some real estate. You're listening to the voice of Appraisal, the #1 appraisal podcast in America that always brings you the latest news and information from the front lines of the real estate market. Anything from market conditions, appraisal regulations, cryptocurrencies, gigantic cobras. Folks, if you have a question, we have all of the answers. We are your one-stop source for all of your real estate appraisal information needs. If you want to be in the know, you have definitely tuned in to the right show. I'm your host, Phil Crawford. Happy to have all of you here with us today. It's going to be a long podcast, but a riveting interview.
It's going to be worth it.
The new book is called The Dispatches from the Cosmic Cobra Breeding Farm. It is by Jeremy Bagott. Jeremy is an appraiser in California, and this thing is causing waves throughout the entire country. Jeremy talks a lot about the Cobra Effect in this book. Now, let me explain what the Cobra Effect is to all of you out there. Back when the British Empire raped and pillaged India, back when they governed India, I should say, there was a little problem with the cobras inside of the city. So the British government came out and made a policy that said that if you bring them a dead cobra, they will pay you money for it so that they can get rid of all the cobras. Well, the breeders found out about this, and they found a way to make money. So they started to breed more and more cobras, and the more cobras that they brought to the government dead, the more money that they made. Well, the British found out, and they stopped the program. Immediately, they said, that's it, it's done. So they stopped the program. All the breeders who had now more cobras than there were to begin with just let their cobras out in the wild because they're not getting paid for it. And because of government policy, the result was basically a bigger problem than what was originally there. And that's basically what is known as the Cobra Effect. Jeremy and I have a good conversation about the book, but at the end of it all, I think we may have some solutions for everybody that are stakeholders in this so we can get through 2020 without having this fourth turning, complete 150% show meltdown that could take place. So please, ladies and gentlemen, enjoy this interview with Jeremy Bagott. And ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special guest on the Voice of Appraisal podcast today. The name of the book is called Dispatches from the Cosmic Cobra Breeding Farm. The author's name is Jeremy Bagott. He is on the line with us today, and this book is making waves throughout the appraisal profession, and I think it's very important, and I really enjoyed reading it. Jeremy, how are you today?
Hey, I'm doing well, Phil. Thanks for having me on. Greetings, Kevin.
Well, we're happy to have you on here. Tell us a little bit about this book. This has gone all throughout the appraisal profession into other avenues as well. Give us a little lowdown and summary as to what the book's about.
Well, it's kind of a romp through a target-rich environment of waste and abuse and sprinkled with a little hubris and dysfunction. I wanted to provide a glimpse to the outside world of this little hidden world that we live in as appraisers.
You've done a terrific job breaking things down, looking at the different nuances within inside the profession and how it's regulated. Let's get into a little bit about the big regulatory issues that we're facing as appraisers today. And what did you find when you were writing this book?
Well, the whole thing is premised on the concept of incorporation by reference, which is this legal mechanism that's found way down in the engine room of government, both at the federal level and at the state level, and something that didn't exist until 1967, at least at the federal level. A little provision in the Freedom of Information Act of 1967 allowed privately held copyrighted standards to be incorporated by reference, both into statutes on the legislative side and then into rules, regulations, also known as the administrative code on the executive side.
So when you're talking about incorporation by reference, the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice, the foundation, is an example of this.
Yes, it is, and one of many. In 2013, Emily Bremer, a legal scholar at Notre Dame, took a tally, and I believe there were 9,500 such private standards incorporated only by reference. If they were to actually print the entire standard, it would be an unlawful seizure of copyrighted material, so they just reference the standard.
I understand. So break it down for us. Break down the foundation, break down what you found out, break down everything.
Okay, so it's quite interesting. When an outside copyrighted standard is selected by, let's say, a federal agency, let's say the Coast Guard wants to incorporate the American Bureau of Shipping standards on ship design. Okay. So the American Bureau of Shipping has been around since the 1850s. No doubt that standard has saved a lot of lives over the years. So they won't tell you, just like the USPAP, won't tell you how to appraise a property.
Or how to build a
American
ship.
Bureau of Shipping Standards won't tell you how to build a ship.
Mm-hmm.
But they'll tell you where the center of buoyancy had better be and how thick the hull had better be and that sort of stuff. So once an organization gets that golden ticket, some wag called it the Ring of Mordor.
The Ring of Mordor.
The Ring of Mordor, the golden ticket to have their copyrighted code embedded into a statute. Once they get that status, then they're essentially given a franchise by the federal government.
Is that why a lot of times you'll see? Is that why a lot of times you'll see the foundation where it says authorized by Congress?
Yes, and it's no different than, let's say, a maker of jams and jellies, who is the official purveyor of jams to Her Royal Highness the Queen of Belgium. It might say official purveyor of jams to. It serves almost like a royal warrant. But remember, the government is not good at picking winners and losers in general. I mean, you only have to look at Solyndra, right?
Right. I understand. So you're saying that there's a lot of these quote-unquote appraisal foundations out there. The accountants use them. The shipbuilders was a good example that you used. And they do set standards. Now, this is the big question here. Do these other entities do a 2-year release like the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice does?
No, that I found to be very rare. And some of these standards that are incorporated by reference into law have had the effect of helping to topple much larger industries, the steel industry, the U.S. shipbuilding industry. Now, overregulation and the incorporation of these standards aren't the single cause.
Right.
But they're thought to be a cause of the decline of many industries, and these are large companies. But what's interesting with the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice and the AQB criteria and the 2-year change cycle is that the profession that's affected is notoriously made up of mom-and-pop companies.
Small businesses.
And we know that regulation in general disproportionately penalizes small business. Now, if you've got a small business and you're hit with additional compliance burdens, as the business owner, you may be the compliance officer, but a larger company may be able to have a dedicated compliance department. So it has the effect of keeping upstarts from ever starting up.
I see this now when it comes to your book, how you explain and how you describe how the Appraisal Foundation is set up. I want to get back to this really quick because I think it's really important. This 2-year process of bringing out a new edition, this gets in the way on a state level with state boards. Can you explain a little bit about what you found with the rulemaking process that the state boards have to go through and the troubles that they can see with a 2-year release, how it's happening so quickly?
Okay, so there's some states, Washington State, California, South Carolina, New Mexico, that can't seem to keep up with this 2-year change cycle.
Why is it? It's called a rulemaking provision, right? Is that what that is?
Okay, so right. So just back up a little bit. Keep in mind that statutes, also known as acts, live over on the legislative side for the most part. And an act might authorize an outside, privately held, copyrighted industry standard.
Okay.
So you might have an act that broadly authorizes it, but then where the rubber meets the road for enforcement is over on the executive branch side. And the executive branch side, that's the branch of government that handles regulations.
Okay.
Regulations are different from statutes in one key feature. Regulations generally include a notice and comment rulemaking process that involves the public.
Right.
And that is key. So certain states, they can get a statute revised in a year, but they can't get a rulemaking done, in some cases, in 2 years. So they're being pressured by the feds, by the ASC, to always enforce the most current version of the uniform standards, or the one that might have been in effect at the time of the appraisal, for example.
Okay.
But in many cases, it will be the most current version.
Yes, okay,
So,
I can understand
but
that.
they can't get a rulemaking done in time. And ironically, the reason they can't get this rulemaking done in time is because of safeguards that have been built in. Like, for instance, in California, they can get the notice and comment process done and maybe a public hearing, but it won't sail through the Department of Finance and the governor's office within the required amount of time before the new version of USPAP comes out. But just in the safeguards that are built into it include things like a cost-benefit analysis of the standard that's being incorporated by reference, or how that standard will affect small businesses.
So you're talking about the states having all of these procedures, and they can't keep up with 2 years. So, Jeremy, does that mean that when you have a state board that has not had the proper rulemaking process, are they in compliance at that time?
No, they're not in compliance.
Do they have authority to regulate?
No. Most states have a provision in their Administrative Procedure Acts that require any outside standard, and this is a key thing, any outside standard that is to be incorporated by reference, it must be a specific version of that standard. And in some cases, when that's not being done, legal scholars who look at this, people like Peter L. Strauss at Columbia and Emily Bremer at Notre Dame and Nina Mendelsohn at the University of Michigan, and also Carl Malamud, an activist at public.resource.org. This is known as a rolling incorporation by reference. And it's essentially the abdication of governing by government to an outside entity. And that's kind of what's happening here is cases in states. Now, there are some states that religiously do a rulemaking around each version of the uniform standards and each version of the AQB criteria.
You mentioned that
Kansas
in the book.
Comes to mind.
Texas.
Kentucky. Maine. Not Texas. Maine,
not Texas. Okay.
And Montana.
Well, it doesn't surprise me.
If you contact the Secretary of State's office in Kansas and you talk to the editor of the Kansas State Register, they will tell you, okay, yes, there was a rulemaking on this date. We did a notice and comment process. 3 people responded. There was a public hearing in Topeka. The new version was adopted. End of story. So at least in states that are doing this in accordance with our own state laws, the states that aren't scofflaws on this point, at least it provides a beachhead for small businesses, i.e. mom and pop appraisal firms, to have a voice in this that is separate from the internal process that the Appraisal Foundation conducts in hotel rooms and hotel banquet rooms around the country.
You make a very good point here because you always hear about all the different meetings that the Appraisal Foundation has, but let's get back to this really quick. I like this. Let's get back to the state issue here. So under this rulemaking process, you're saying that there's a public meeting where appraisers, participants, small business owners go to these public meetings during the rulemaking process. So in other words, I'm not in front of an Appraisal Foundation person. I'm not in front of anything appraisal. I'm just in front of a lawmaker, correct?
Exactly, yes.
I'm in front of my representative.
Right. And remember that the process that the Appraisal Foundation puts on, it does have kind of a beguiling likeness to a rulemaking. It has discussion drafts and deliberation and public hearing component and independent counsels, but it has no member of the Appraisal Standards Board who's ever taken an oath to faithfully execute any position of any particular state or any federal agency, or none of them have been appointed by the governor or elected into office. So it really has no meeting that takes place in Las Vegas of one of those boards, really has no bearing from a legal standpoint on people's business in the state of name your state or territory or federal government.
So let's say, for instance, we have a state who goes through rulemaking and they adopt a certain version of USPAP. Are they consistently playing catch-up? Is that what's going on, Jeremy? Are they consistently playing it? Or are they just giving up and trying to figure this out?
Well, just like Prohibition.
Yeah.
Prohibition was designed to try to get Americans not to drink. But it had the effect, actually, of corrupting many public officials who would not otherwise have been corrupted. And I think in this case, with this 2-year change cycle, it's put public officials in a pretty tough spot if they can't get a rulemaking done within that 2-year period. And it may even be worse than that because the rulemaking may need to be done before the new version even comes out, in which case it's just a matter of months. But as I said, I had an off-the-record conversation with a highly placed agency head who told me that in his state, underground regulations, that is, the enforcement of regulations that haven't actually gone through a rulemaking, are pretty common. He said that it can take 1 year to have a statute revised, but it may take 2 years to do a rulemaking. So they just kind of bluff.
They just kind of, what do you say? They kind of bluff?
They bluff. They bluff. They hope that they won't be called on it.
You realize that an appraiser, if they spell a word wrong, anybody, Tom, Dick, and Harry out there can say that they've got a USPAP violation. And you're telling me that a person that's authorized to regulate can bluff? That's the word?
Yes. It's ironic that certain state agencies that are tasked with enforcing administrative laws sometimes break those laws as an expedient to enforcing them.
Let me ask you this question. I brought up in the last show, we've reached the fourth turning on the foundation. We've reached the fourth turning on this 2-year cycle that's breaking down in front of us. First, you said all of these other letters that are out there that are being done throughout the country, shipping, everything else. If I'm not mistaken, what the Appraisal Foundation does every 2 years when it revises its standards and changes them, in other avenues and other professions, this is a big, big deal. This is something that is like massive to come out with something like this.
Yes. In my book, I wanted to show 2 state agencies, one that's gone rogue and one that's doing it according to the state's Administrative Procedure Act and also its administrative code.
Okay.
So I found the Texas Appraisal Board, the TALCB, I think it's called.
Yeah.
In this case, they simply don't even attempt to put each new version of use path through a rulemaking. But then I found a state agency that does. It's a sad commentary, but just simply adhering to your state laws is now suddenly a reason for commendation. But I find myself commending the Texas Railroad Commission.
Okay.
It's a big deal normally, and in some states it's very seldom done. So they incorporated the National Fire Protection Association's National Fuel Gas Code and its Liquefied Petroleum Gas Code, this 2006 version and the 2008 version. And the rules attorney that I got to know was very proud of how they had checked all the boxes. They were very willing to share with me the steps that had been taken to carry out a legal rulemaking of that. And the National Fire Protection Association, just like any other standards issuer, like the Appraisal Foundation, in this case, it's a Massachusetts-based nonprofit that has its own internal process that looks like rulemaking. There's discussion drafts and public hearings and subject matter experts on their panels.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, the Texas Railroad Commission did everything right. So I compare that to the corner cutting, and essentially it's official corruption. It's the absence of governance to just allow an outside standards issuer to have carte blanche access to rulemaking in a little corner of the Texas Administrative Code in perpetuity. That's essentially what's happening here.
Is that allowed?
It's only allowed as long as those who it's being enforced on don't challenge it. But otherwise, it seems like it's completely teed up for some kind of court challenge.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at right here. I think a lot of people on the state boards are going to look at your book, and I hope they don't look at it with the perspective of, especially with Arrow, I hope they don't look at it with the perspective of this is adversarial to me. I think they need to look at this book more as chemotherapy to say if you've got problems in your body politic, you need to take this book, read it. It's going to hurt. It's going to hurt. But talk about mom and pop appraisal shops out there today. That's a great majority of the residential appraisers that are out there.
Right. Overregulation almost invariably punishes small business. It disproportionately burdens small business. And large companies sometimes even appreciate the regulation because they are the best equipped to deal with it.
To handle the regulation. Does certain states have what are called sort of like small business advocates? Is there any small business advocates that are in there?
Yeah, glad you asked. Okay, so states that flout rulemaking, it doesn't even matter if a state has a small business advocate's office in the office of the governor, for example. Mm-hmm. But if the states that do engage in correct rulemaking for the incorporation by reference into regulations, then one of those sign-offs is almost always the advocate for small business in that state. And some states have statutes. The federal government has statutes that require special attention to regulations that have the potential to disproportionately punish small business.
And that's where a person can go to a small business advocacy inside of their state?
Well, let's put it this way. When a rulemaking is done correctly, there's a cost-benefit analysis normally. There are a whole bunch of agency sign-offs that are required. Now, it takes time. And if you're a alpha agency head and you've been appointed by the governor to get things done, the administrative code section, usually it's the editor of the state register and the tillers and toilers of the administrative code, they're kind of seen as like the cat lady in the basement apartment. Mm-hmm. That nobody really wants to get involved in a long conversation with the person, and they don't want to know what unhygienic things might be going on. But they treat it, if you're a hard-charging agency head, you may not want to be slowed down by some obscure agency way down in the plumbing of government that could impose their laws on you. You want to get things done. So I think some of that is going on here, but also just plain old dysfunction. I think some states realize they can't get a rulemaking done in time, so they don't try.
Unbelievable. You bring up the point of antitrust. You talk about the dental case and competitors being on these boards. Tell me a little bit about what you find out about antitrust. A lot of people say that I scream and holler too much about it. What's your thoughts on this?
Well, I think there are a lot of possibilities here for conflicts of interest and perceived conflicts of interest. Mm-hmm. So one state appraisal board, I'm not going to tell you which one, you have to read the book. But anyway, they don't have any licensed appraisers on their in-house team, folks doing enforcement and so forth.
Okay.
They have a couple people that have gotten through most of the classes, the qualifying education, or that had a license lapsed. But then they have a roster of outside contract enforcement people, and those might be niche people, like maybe a complaint comes in about the appraisal of a C-store or gas station or something like that.
Okay.
So the head of the licensing entity there told me that they usually just ask the person, do you know the appraiser that's under investigation? And if the answer is no, that's enough for them. But the fact of the matter is that it's possible that if it's a niche,
right.
There may be only 2 or 3 appraisers that do gas stations in that state. So now it's somebody you're competing with. You may not know them.
But they know you. But they know you because they're competing with you. Yeah.
So
they're reviewing you. Oh, gee. Yeah. Go ahead. Keep on going, Jeremy. You're fine. Keep on going.
But I think it's a kind of a nightmare of an appraiser who's gone through thousands of hours of log experience and hundreds of hours of qualifying and continuing education to be called on the carpet, and whose license could be revoked by one person or a panel of people that maybe somebody that's gone through the enforcement 1, 2, and 3 crash courses.
Okay, now hold on. Now wait. Okay, let's talk about Investigator 1, 2, and 3. Tell me about Investigator 1, 2, and 3. Those courses at the Appraisal Foundation.
Okay, so it's about a 2.5-day course each one, and it's another way that the Appraisal Foundation has made itself indispensable. In this case, it was the subprime crisis.
Right.
As soon as that subprime crisis materialized, it was shown to the world that, wow, this uniform standard of a professional appraisal practice and the AQB criteria didn't stave off a major boom and bust cycle that resulted in banks having to be bailed out and Mr. and Mrs. Taxpayer having to foot the bill.
Right.
So then the operative word was enforcement after that, that obviously a set of standards that change every 2 years and that attempt to account for every sparrow's fall, a constant circle squaring exercise. How could it be that these standards, perfected over so many different versions, still resulted in a major boom and bust cycle? Mm-hmm. So obviously it must be enforcement. So at that point, Appraisal Foundation began developing course material, and a new grant stream came in from the Appraisal Subcommittee into the Appraisal Foundation, specifically earmarked for state enforcement. And then the Appraisal Foundation began paying. And of course, when we say the Appraisal Foundation, we're about us. We began as appraisers paying to train state enforcement folks using material that's co-owned by the Appraisal Foundation and paying for food, lodging, travel expenses. And then I learned that some of these folks are outside that are benefiting from this are not state employees. They're outside contractors.
But okay, so you're bringing in a sheriff is what you're doing. You're bringing in an outside sheriff into an area. The question is this person that's a paid contractor that's taking the Investigator 1, 2, and 3 courses and then is called in because there's a complaint at the state board over a very niche piece of property. Is this person also the competitor of this individual? In that particular case, I didn't focus so much on the potential conflict of interest, and there really is one. I looked more at the idea of public money going from the Appraisal Subcommittee into a 501c3 and then being parceled back out to private individuals, in essence, putting them in business as contract enforcers. And in some cases, these are fee appraisers. They're competing with you and me. And then they're also, in a sense, put in business as contract enforcers. And I don't like my competitors being my enforcer. I don't like that.
Right. There's a whole slew of
Keep on
potential
going.
problems
Sorry.
with this.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But I'm more focused on the gift of public funds, even though the money is going into a 501c3. In the ASC, in its annual reports, that money is earmarked for state enforcement. And it feels like, wow, this money is going into a slop sink and then being parceled back out to private individuals, in essence, putting them in business. And then, as it was explained to me, some individuals have then gone to second, third, fourth states, and they become
roving enforcement folks.
Yeah,
roving enforcers. Judge Dreads. They're Judge Dreads.
And we're paying for that. We're paying for that.
One thing that actually shocked me in the book, I didn't know this, is when you become a USPAP instructor, you sign a confidentiality agreement? Is that?
Yes, and the Appraisal Edition will tell you on its website that is one of the criteria for becoming a USPAP instructor is signing a confidentiality agreement. So I asked the USPAP instructor, hey, did you sign a confidentiality agreement? And then he would not tell me. And then I asked him, well, did they have you sign a second confidentiality agreement ensuring the confidentiality of the first agreement? And then he started laughing, and I started laughing, and he told me a little bit about it. But not anything about it that violated it does exist, but that's about all I got.
But as far as confidentiality agreements are concerned, we are talking about a copywritten piece of material here. So I don't think that would be something that's out of the norm.
I don't fault the Appraisal Foundation is like this organism.
Yeah.
And it's doing a good job at what it's supposed to do, and that is it's supposed to create standards, it's supposed to create spin-off materials, it's supposed to make itself indispensable to government, it's supposed to find ways to develop new products that tie in to this government franchise that it's been handed. It's doing nothing that, let's say, the American Bureau of Shipping or ASME, the American Society for Mechanical Engineers, or IEEE or ISO or any standards issuing organization would do. I'm questioning the whole thing, and I'm especially looking at the way that 2-year change cycle affects small businesses and how it works elsewhere compared to this system, which just appears abusive.
Well, I think you make very good points here. And the other thing I want to bring up, and yes, this 2-year cycle, I think we're coming to an end, but you also bring up this point about USPAP and the confidentiality. These other organizations, and correct me if I'm wrong, but they don't have this, oh God, I'm going to get in so much trouble. They don't have this religious fervor that the uniform standards has. I call them religious zealots. Am I off base here by saying that?
No, you're not. It's a little bit of a priesthood. Maybe the USPAP instructors are the Gauleiters or the block captains or something in the whole thing. But there's a slight religious feel to it.
There is.
So
you're right.
You're not off base.
Okay, so you have a part in your book. If you're acting as an appraiser, it'd be a USPAP violation, but I'm just kidding you. It's not. But I'm going to bring this up to you because
I'm ready.
It's incredible. I'm surprised no one has even brought this up to you. I'm really surprised because they probably haven't read the book yet. On page 141.
Oh, boy.
Now, it's really interesting, your book. By the way, if you want to know what Dave Bunton's salary is, that's on page 69. Of all the pages, it's got to be on page 69, okay? But on page 141, you state in here, then there are the aforementioned members of the Foundation's Appraisal Standards Board and Appraisal Qualifications Board. Now, the term is Appraisers Qualifications Board, not Appraisal Qualifications Board, okay? Okay, Jeremy. So I'm just going to have to call all you on because now your credibility is destroyed. You're done. You're done, brother. Right. You're done. You are a dumb son of a. Because I'll tell you something. No, and it's true. I said that accidentally on this show. I accidentally said Appraisal Qualifications Board, and you should have heard the emails that came into me. You're done. You're wrong. You know, it's the almighty USPAPA, and really, you have been able to in this book take a layperson like my producer Kevin here and really show this little corner of the world to people that wouldn't understand it. And as we step back from it now as appraisers and as other readers, it looks a little Lord of the Flies to me. It really does. It's really, really strange.
Okay, I agree that I was trying to take this little hidden world and try to make it accessible, but I was kind of thinking like Herbie the Love Bug goes to Monte Carlo for all the zaniness and the location-driven aspects, meets Kafka's The Trial for the surreal, the capture of the surreal. Also, I could keep going. I thought of Legally Blonde 2 meets the California DMV meets Boardwalk Empire. Something like that.
I love it. I love it. The book is extremely easy to read. And when I got done,
that was my intent.
When I got done with it, my head, I'm talking to you right now, and my head is spinning in 100 different directions because it goes to show you how f***ed up things really are, man. I mean, it really is.
It's demoralizing.
It is demoralizing. Let me ask you a question, Jeremy.
Yeah.
How many corrupt appraisers are there out there? Percentage-wise, how many corrupt?
Well,
I'm guessing one or two.
I don't really know.
I know, but I'm guessing 1 or 2. 2%.
Okay, but here's the problem.
Tell me.
Here's the problem. What if fewer than 1% of appraisers were thoroughly corrupt? The regulation has its place, right? Keeping employees safe on the factory floor, right? Regulation says you've got to have an eye wash station, something like that. But here's where regulation falls way out of line, and that is when folks get together and try to imagine the thinking, to try to account for every sparrow's fall in relation to every bad actor. Oh, we missed something here. A bad actor could do X or could do Y.
Okay.
So it turns into a giant circle squaring exercise, and it comes at the expense of most everyone else who are honest.
It's sort of like you're always trying to find the loopholer. Who's got the loophole? And we have to change
to appraisers like Marcy Rogers in Bonita Springs, Florida, or Eric Kennedy in Mount Olive, North Carolina, or Mike Schenck in Vancouver, Washington. And I asked them, what if you were appraising to the 2004 uniform standards? Or what if you were appraising to the 2012 standards? Would your work product be any less credible, any less honest?
Yes.
And the answer was no. So all of this change, it attempts to account for the lowest common denominator, a very small percentage. And ironically, some of the things I found suggest that some of the thoroughly malicious appraisers or felonious appraisers, it can take longer. Those are the guys that seem to get away with it.
Well, they get away with it.
While other people get zinged who are well-intentioned, maybe just missed punctilio.
Right. You're exactly right. It's usually the hardcore fraudsters are basically out of it, and they'll never get reported to the state board. That's what we've seen in the past, right?
Right. That was my feeling.
Yes. Yeah. No, this is just
my research.
It's unbelievable. At the end of the day, it sounds like we definitely have some big issues here. I like to talk about solutions. From your perspective of everything that you've covered in this very good book and your in-depth knowledge of the topic, give me some solutions. Give me at least something that we can work with to help this problem, especially when it comes to state boards and state regulators. It sounds like to me the state regulators, if you're using the word bluff, they've got some big issues. Yeah,
I think the white-hot core of the dysfunction, a boil that kind of needs to be lanced, is that 2-year change cycle. It will completely change the Appraisal Foundation's business model.
But it needs to come to an end is what you're saying.
But it does need to come to an end. It needs to be something like maybe a 5-year change cycle, if that. And that will give states the opportunity to do a proper rulemaking, and it will give them no excuse for not doing a rulemaking. And just like the ending of prohibition, now public officials will need to be accountable again. And that's not what's going on now. They're getting pressured by the feds, by the ASC, to always enforce the most current version of the uniform standards or the version that was enforced at the time of maybe a violation.
Sure.
They're getting pressure by the feds to clear up cases within an arbitrary time frame, 1 year. But that, I think the center of this dysfunction is with that 2-year change cycle and what it's doing to the states, but also what it's doing to mom and pop appraisers.
Yeah.
The lost work time, the $75 for the new use PAP, the hundreds of dollars for the refresher, the 7-hour use PAP course, having to constantly make new checklists and remember what the changes were.
Yeah.
So those are factors. But I think what it's doing to the states is the bigger one.
Let's talk about Dave Bunton. You explain Dave Bunton in this book almost historically. You don't beat up on him that much. You really don't. You describe him in the book down to his mustache, his build, his athleticism, his ability to control a room, to work a room. You do a very good job describing this man.
Well, I think he's remarkable and masterful at showing a high degree of technical bravura and acumen in what he does. It's nothing that no other nonprofit wouldn't do. It was a triple negative, wasn't it?
Yeah, but that's okay.
Sorry about that. It's he's doing nothing that any other nonprofit would do with this golden
ticket, the authorization by Congress.
And he's created an amazing ecosystem, which you see with other standards issuers, that always involve different certifications and tie-in products to their core standards that they've had enshrined in law, in federal law or state law. And it's created, in effect, he's set the standards for standards issuing. It's part of this Cobra.
The Cobra Effect.
And that is that an organization like the Appraisal Foundation has every incentive to want to keep changing the standards. And they have every incentive to charge whatever they feel they can get away with. There's no hidden hand of the market working on this pricing, because they are the official purveyor of the uniform standards and of the AQB criteria. The Appraisal Foundation has that golden ticket.
And they're not an advocate. They're not an advocacy group.
No, they're not.
Said it 100 times.
501c3, they're not allowed to do much lobbying.
Right.
But somehow through education and through their alliances with a couple of 501c6 organizations that are allowed to do a lot of lobbying, their position has been solidified. The position of the uniform standards has been solidified to the point that it's almost unthinkable a world in which appraisers didn't appraise to the uniform standards.
So, obviously, a lot of people have been talking about the money that Dave Bunton makes. Talk to me a little bit about the Bunton salary.
All right. So we learned after the fact that the $760,000 that he reported on the Foundation's Form 990 for 2017 was bifurcated, if you will.
Oh.
Was made up.
Sorry, what the hell are you doing to me? What are you doing to me? All right, go ahead. All
right. So anyway, it consisted of a memo that was kind of a mysterious memo that was undated and unsigned. I've learned since that memo was, in fact, from the Appraisal Foundation.
Okay.
So that compensation came from two internal silos in the Appraisal Foundation. One was a retirement payout, and the other one was his normal CEO pay. So there are a lot of open questions with that, and I'd very much like to see the 2018 and 2019 Form 990s when they're available. The 2017 is the most recent one that is available. The Appraisal Foundation has $4.9 million, or at least in 2017, had $4.9 million in cash savings and publicly traded equities. Much of that was once our money. Nothing like it could be found with the Appraisal Foundation's Cause IQ peers. I looked at 7 peers. In all but one case, that $4.9 million represented multiples of what its peer nonprofits in the Beltway had on hand. Its liabilities are routinely about $600,000. Okay. So anyway, I think we need to be very hands-on as appraisers. What's going on with the Appraisal Foundation? The IRS gives us that Form 990. If an organization wants to be a nonprofit and tax-exempt, that's what they have to do. That's the trade-off. They have to file a Form 990, and that Form 990 is publicly accessible. So we can see a little bit into the organization. So there's no excuse from here on in for appraisers to complain about the status quo if they're not also doing things like looking at the Appraisal Foundation's Form 990 as it comes available. You can access it at ProPublica Nonprofit Explorer.
Before the bonus, he's pulling 260, right?
360, and then it pretty much doubled with this. I called it a double haircut. A sitting CEO receiving both his CEO pay and retirement while he's not retired should be scrutinized.
I look at Dave Bunton, and I said this on other shows, as an NFL owner. And if at the end of the day, I don't really care what the NFL team's owner makes as long as he gives me a team. And I used in my last show, I compared Bob Kraft for the Patriots to Mike Brown, my crappy Bengals, right? Bob Kraft can do whatever he wants. It doesn't matter how much money he makes. Mike Brown is a jerk because he just makes too much money. And I think that if Bunton at this particular moment, because this has gone wildfire, everybody's got this now, right? I think if Dave looked at this and said, I think I've got some stakeholders here that I have neglected or have felt neglected, and I need to do something, now would be the time to do something in a way to get your perception, to get yourself over to the Bob Kraft side.
Yes. So in the past, we've been getting more government than we're paying for, and I think we need to get less government. I think less is more.
That's a great point. Less is more. So in other words, I don't care what money you make, just leave me alone and let me live my life and perform my business.
Yes.
Yes. So what we can take from this is, yes, just leave us alone. You don't need to be in here every 2 years screwing up our entire shops.
And we're willing to give you a raise for that.
And we will give you a raise for it, and you will be Bob Kraft.
I will say that when I interviewed Bunton, he told me that our goal is to build up a long-term reserve, and that's how he accounted for this long, slow accumulation of almost $5 million in cash and stocks, to which I would say, wow, that's the goal of the 80,000 appraisers who pay into the system, is to build up a long-term cash reserve, and I think we need it.
I think we need it big time. The one critique I have from the foundation, I've hit it on the show so many times, the Appraisal Institute, and by the way, I'm going to come full disclosure with you. I really like Appraisal Institute people. I like Appraisal Institute appraisers. I love SRAs, MAIs, and I love Appraisal Institute education. I do. I love it, okay? I learned so much from it. But I hate Appraisal Institute leadership. And I think in a way, you consistently talk about this golden ticket. We've called it the Ring of Mordor. I think a lot of that leadership over there would like to have that golden ticket that the foundation has, and I think that's where you get a lot of that aggression there. And
don't think for a second that the Appraisal Institute wouldn't become the Appraisal Foundation if it had this golden ticket.
Because you become like the Gollum. You end up becoming it.
Yes.
But at the same time, the Institute, the foundation, other organizations, they've got their Cobras. There's so many Cobras inside of their organizations. And I look around the whole country and say, okay, they have no image. There's no ability to do PR correctly for appraisers out there. And that's been my big thing on this show. You know, we just need good public relations. If we get to the consumers first and the consumers go, wait a second, what the heck is going on in your world? I think you'd find some good things there. And maybe less is more is better from the foundation. It's a great way to put that. We'll pay you more, but we want less is more. That's how it is, you know. No problem.
Sounds good to me.
Do you think at this point in time, I'm 45 years old, and do you think at this time we're going to hit a point very soon where regulation shuts this down, where it really starts to get into a bad position?
Well, in the book, I talk about the bootleggers and Baptists model for understanding the motivation of laws in America. And I think what's happened here is a real classic bootleggers and Baptists model. It derives from a dry law in Kentucky where on Sundays the state would not allow the sale of alcohol. So the Baptists liked that. They liked it on its face value. They approved of that state law. But the bootleggers also liked it because of its ability to be undermined. And I think the more you lock in licensed appraisers to this Byzantine, multi-layered, chaotic regulatory system, the more it allows the bootleggers, i.e. political actors and business actors that don't want to have a live human being or a grown-up looking at these properties that are being collateralized. So the bootleggers would approve of a high degree of appraisal regulation, and so would the Baptists. The Baptists would be like the Appraisal Foundation, or folks that honestly believe that we need this very high level of oversight.
Yeah.
And then all the while, it's giving the bootleggers the opportunity to plead that, hey, this is dysfunctional. We need waivers. We need higher thresholds. We need bifurcation.
Yeah, and that's what you're starting to see.
So I think that answered your question, but I'm not 100% sure.
No, it did. It did. Because I want the appraisers out there that are listening to the show to understand this world that we're living in. And at the same time, this appraisal world is a strange little place, but yet we make lending work. We get the wheels of lending going. And to see the pressures that we have, listen, buy the book, guys. Buy the book. Buy Jeremy's book, because I'm not going to give it all away. But one of the stories that you have is absolutely remarkable about the bounty hunter that is clearing an apartment building for some fugitive. But he was an appraiser but couldn't handle the heat, couldn't handle the stress. So he decided to become a freaking bounty hunter.
Yes, that is Ashley Woldhood. That is her story. She is an appraiser in the Salt Lake City area. I think that story really illustrates an irony here.
Yeah, I would think so. I'd rather go into a building with a gun with some guy trying to shoot me than be an appraiser. That'll tell you a few things.
Yes, yeah.
That'll tell you a few things. I get a lot of emails from appraisers that are going through these state board investigations and stuff, and the amount of stress that is on their shoulders because of these investigations is ungodly. And right now, it's going to get worse. Trust me, it's going to get worse because more and more people are going to complain because they think their houses are worth more. And I'm hoping that we find some sort of solution to this issue in 2020 as quickly as we can, because this is the next crisis in the appraisal profession. As I get in all of the emotional emails and things like this, have you seen the new Joker movie yet, Mr.
I have not. Not.
So there's a YouTube, and I'm not going to blow the storyline, but there's a scene in the new Joker movie where he's in a subway and there's these three Wall Street guys, and they start picking on him and picking on him and picking on him, picking on him, and that's the moment.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really, really afraid that as this regulatory system continues to multiply and it continues to drag down, people are going to have that moment, and hopefully it won't end up the way that it did in a Joker movie. But there's going to come a time that a larger firm is going to say enough's enough, and I'm going to go after a state board on this stuff.
Yes,
I see that coming.
I think several state boards, more than several, are primed and teed up for that kind of action, and I'd really like to see it happen.
Yeah, unbelievable. As our numbers, more and more people retire, and as they retire and there's fewer active appraisers to even sit on the boards, it brings your competitors even closer and closer to you. These are the people that regulate you. So if I've got my competitor up there who I've been battling for the last 20 years for work in the same area, and all of a sudden now they're regulating me, I can see somebody going, by the way, where's your rulemaking process? Do you guys even have authority over me at this point in time?
California was the only state I could find that acknowledges that it has a scofflaw problem with state agencies, and it has the Office of Administrative Law, the OAL. Have you ever seen the movie Waterworld from like the 1990s?
Who hasn't? I love Waterworld. I've watched it. I binge watch Waterworld. I do. It's great.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, Kevin Costner at his best. What's that?
You know the smokers, right?
The smoker. Yeah.
Right.
What's his name? The classic.
Dennis Hopper.
Dennis Hopper. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
So there's this poor devil that's down at the bottom with the bunker fuel, right? He's got these spectacles. You know what I'm talking about?
Yes. I know exactly what you're saying. Yeah.
That's the OAL in California. That's the Office of Administrative Law. They're like the state agency that no one wants. They're doing some task and no one really cares about them, and they're way down deep in the bunker fuel. Okay, so if you go to the OAL's website, you can see they have a special web page that explains regulation and explains something called underground regulation, which is in California we have 200 separate state agencies. So some of them are enforcing underground regulations, and they have a way you can report it, and it will be looked at by some kind of joint committee. But the real remedy will be a lawsuit, in my mind.
Oh, no, I can see it coming. I can see it coming, if not from a big entity, probably maybe even from a class action. I can see it coming in that direction, too.
Right, or a legal scholar.
A legal scholar.
Maybe, or a nonprofit like the American Civil Liberties Union or something like that.
Right, because when you take a look at all of the licensed professionals out there today, I don't think there's a single one that deals with the stress and anxieties and really just the tyranny that the appraisers have to go through.
As Ashley Wolf has told me, you have to be perfect.
You have to be perfect every time. In every appraisal report that you've ever done or I've ever done or anybody's ever done, there is imperfection. It's just part of it. There's imperfection. The other thing is that, and I will bring this up with you, the insurance premiums. This overregulation, the free market is starting to regurgitate it because the premiums on appraisers, E&O insurance, rise dramatically when there is a state complaint. Even if it's something, just a minor infraction and nothing to do with any major effect on the value or impact on the value, the appraiser then is effectively out of business because of this one complaint, or the appraiser is put on multiple do not use lists throughout the country, and they're effectively out of business. So when you look at this regulatory system that we've got, one shot and you're done. You're done. That's it. And that's a shame. That's got to be.
I agree.
Got to be. There's got to be something deeper in the world, that a greater authority that's got to say this can't happen. This is just abusive process or something along those lines.
Well, maybe it just starts with baby steps.
I think you're right.
Little bites, like elongating the 2-year change cycle and focusing maybe more on enforcement rather than constant regulatory change.
Educating our boards about the problems that they could perhaps get into.
Perhaps. I think there is a little bit of arrogance in state government, and I think some state government have become dangerously dependent on the fees that are being brought in for licensees just across the board.
I understand.
In California, we had the Bureau of Real Estate Appraisers build up a $20 million surplus. Now, this is a spoiler alert. This is in the book. They built up a $20 million surplus. It was allowed to somehow accumulate, equating to about $1,000 per licensee.
Yeah.
That surplus was then rated by the state in a forced loan to its general fund. And then the good news is it was paid back over time at a pretty good rate of return at 10%.
Okay, all right.
However, during that payback period, the board was found to have feather-bedded, hiring $843,000 annually in additional payroll and also engaging in non-mission critical travel. But then once that money ran out, they eliminated that $842,000 annual payroll positions, and they pledged to eliminate non-mission critical travel. And at the same time, they raised the fee, for example, a certified general up to almost $1,000.
I did hear that. Yeah, I heard that, yeah.
So I feel like there's a lot of abuse and arrogance at the state level, and I'm not feeling like many of these state agencies are victims, although you are appealing to my better angels, and I like to think maybe my book would have the effect of helping them to affect some change.
But like I said before, your book is going to have to be chemotherapy. It's going to hurt. It's not going to feel good. Look, stuff like this, it's not about lawsuits. Stuff like this gets onto Wall Street Journal, New York Times. This gets a lot of publicity behind it, especially anything that has to do with banking. That's where a lot of this comes into play. So it's a matter of publicity. It's a matter of perception. And this book, I tell you, it's a game changer. I think you're right. I think the baby step that we should focus in on throughout 2020 is getting perhaps a 5-year rolling edition of USPAP instead of a 2-year. Sounds like it puts the states in a bad position. Did the Institute say that too? The Institute said that too, right?
And the Institute has warned the Appraisal Foundation. And also, can I just say something?
Yeah.
I think there was some feeling that maybe I didn't take the Institute to task.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Or let's say some of the sponsors, such as IRWA or American Society for Farm Managers and Rural Appraisers. And I belong to the latter two. Mm-hmm. I belong to all three, as a matter of fact. If I can use a historical quote from a couple hundred years ago, millions for charity, but not one penny for tribute. Mm-hmm. And that means to me that, hey, I have the option of quitting the Appraisal Institute or IRWA if I don't like their actions or I don't like their fee increases or for whatever reason, I can quit. Uh-huh. But with the Appraisal Foundation, we 80,000 appraisers are at bayonet point asked to be shareholders in this nonprofit. We are providing them a chunk of the biennial license renewal fee. Yeah. And also they are brandishing a franchise cartel, and we are basically the captive audience. There's no other purveyor of the uniform standards that we can go to.
Jeremy, we have two different states. We have mandatory states and we have voluntary states, right? And in a voluntary state, you don't have to have a license to perform appraisal practice or perform an appraisal as long as it's not a federally related transaction, right? Interesting question for you, and just food for thought. When you take a look at the appraisers out there that do quote-unquote evaluations but are not licensed, but maybe they're designated, okay, but they're not licensed, okay? It would be very interesting to look at their average annual income based upon the workload that they get, and then look at the licensed appraiser and look at that average annual income and see if there's any difference there. Because it all comes down to dollars, right? And you said you have your option. You can quit the Institute if you don't like what they're doing, or you can join it or stay with them. But when it comes down to dollars, appraisers making money in their pocket, what if the evaluator can pull $150,000 a year, but the licensed or certified appraiser that has to follow USPAP can only pull $70,000?
Yes, and I think that still ties into that bootleggers and Baptists model by economist Bruce Yandel at Clemson. The bootleggers, they want the dysfunction.
Because they make more money.
It justifies the use of the evaluators, the waivers, and the bifurcated concept and the thresholding.
Wow. We've learned a lot in this conversation. Jeremy, what's next for you in your life? You're an appraiser.
Let's see. That's a very good question. I may have a couple of books left in me at some point, but I think just trying to merge my role as a professional citizen with being an employed appraiser. I think that would be a good start.
I think that if your appraisal reports are done with as much detail as your book is written, then I'm sure your appraisal reports are just fine. This is an excellent book. It's a game changer for the entire industry. You've done a terrific job on it. You went out on a limb, and I think that people should back up your efforts. I do have one thing I want to talk to you about really quick.
Yeah.
There's one other issue here. You were talking about Jim Park, and he was going to expos, summits, and trade shows.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't mention Appraiser Fest. Jim Park was at Appraiser Fest. Jeremy, between the appraisers, standard, whatever, what the hell, the appraisers qualification board, no Appraiser Fest mentioned in here whatsoever. What the is that? What are you doing to me?
I'm sorry. I know that the Appraiser Fest is something like the Lilith Fair for appraisers. Is that right? Or
the Appraiser
something
Fest.
like that?
I don't know if there'll be another one or not. I don't know. It cost me too much money, and I lost too much money. To be honest,
no. I'm not sure that the Appraiser Fest can even be categorized.
Yes,
maybe it needs its own.
I mean, it just has to be Appraiser Fest. I mean, it's just
not
what it is.
It's not a summit. It's not an expo. Is that right?
No, it was a happening. It was a happening. That's what it was. There'll be something in the future. And
I would consider a new category.
Excellent book. I recommend everybody go out there and get your own copy. You can get it on Amazon.com today. Dispatches from the Cosmic Cobra Breeding Farm. Jeremy Bagott, thank you very much for everything that you've done, and thank you for the book.
Thanks for having me on, Phil, and thank you, Kevin.
So there goes Jeremy Bagott with dispatches from the...
Phil.
Damn! All I got to say is my head is spinning right now, Kevin.
I'm just sitting here like, what just
happened? That got real.
Yeah.
That got real. I'm sorry, folks. I guess I'm just like, I read the book. It took me 2 nights to read it. And
everybody
go
out
buy
there
Amazon,
has to read this book.
Amazon.com. Go buy it. How much did I pay for this thing? $14, $15? It's not that much, but it's amazing. And you know, and here's the bottom line. Dave Bunton has an open invitation on this show. He's got an open invitation on this show. I'm very respectful when it comes to my interviews. I think everybody knows that. And maybe some good things will come from it. Maybe we'll look at 5-year changes to USPAP instead of the 2-year cycle. Maybe we'll look at state boards going, wait a second, these guys, they're starting to rumble a little bit too much, and we may be pressing down on them a little bit too much. Maybe we need to have a new set of protocols when it comes to complaints and stuff like that. Maybe the foundation will look at this and say less is more. They did away with the Appraiser Practices Board. Maybe they make some changes immediately because lending still has to go on. The fuel of the economy still has to keep going. And if you've got a lot of appraisers out there that are going, hey, look, this isn't going to work, 30 years later, we got a lot of Cobras, Kevin. Yeah.
What I was going to say, Phil, is what I like about Jeremy's book and I like about the podcast that we do in that.
Yeah.
Everybody out there has to realize if you are not satisfied with something, with the status quo.
Right. Right.
If you just sit there and say nothing and do nothing, it's just going to keep going. You have to speak up.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. And that's what Jeremy did here.
Yeah.
So I give him all the credit. It's a good book. And, folks, we will be back very soon. I do have an open invitation for Dave Bunton to come on the show whenever he wants. That'll be the next show that we put out if he wants to come out. If not, we'll probably put another show out mid-February. You guys have a terrific month. Stay busy, okay? Stay busy because the interest rates are going down. 10-year Treasury's going down. They did come out with a 20-year note. They want to put out a 20-year bond. Steve Mnuchin said that over at the Treasury Secretary. I have a conspiracy theory that if they put out a 20-year note,
of course you do.
I know if they put out a 20-year note, they may tie 40 and 50-year money to it. 40 or 50-year mortgages on the way. I don't know. That's just what I'm thinking.
And
could be totally wrong.
And of course, if the 40, 50-year mortgage hits, just like Japan, there's going to be the 100-year mortgage.
Japan is basically the model of America for the next 20 years. My personal opinion. That's what I got from listening to all the talking heads over at Davos this last week, too. Okay? So, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our show for this week. And as always, I would like to thank you for listening. As we journey through the mysteries and complexities that are, in fact, the real estate appraisal profession, I would like to thank our guest, Jeremy Bagott, the author of Dispatches from the Cosmic Cobra Breeding Farm, for being here for his thoughtful insight and knowledge. God willing, we're going to be back here very soon, continuing to report from the front lines of the real estate market. In the meantime, you kiss your spouse, you hug your children, enjoy your day. Be safe in the field. You've been listening to Phil Crawford on Voice of Appraisal. We'll talk very soon.